Important difference between HIV and other diseases because you actually have to build an entire infrastructure to deliver daily therapy and daily prevention. For those who don't know, a third of adults were infected in many countries, 2/3 of pregnant women in some districts.
Was it clear to you, to anyone at the outset, that this was a fight where we could turn the tide without a vaccine?
It's $500 million over 5 years. The president adopted it, but then he turned and said, this is a nice start. I want to do something big, which led to antiretroviral therapy, which has saved 25 million lives. The way we do trials is absurd. We are still doing things and we have processes the way we did them 75 years ago. Literally within 10 years, we should be looking back and saying chemotherapy was barbaric. The same way we would look back at bloodletting now. Unemployment among young men in particular is 50, 60, 70%. That, and I know our national security people worry about this. That is a recipe for global instability that will damage the United States in ways that pandemics, are as child's play. When I was in the administration, because PEPFAR was so important to President Bush, I was privileged to be in meetings with heads of state, and they didn't want to work with China. They wanted to work with us, but we couldn't offer them what they needed, which was someone to support their economic growth and development as a comprehensive approach. It's what the countries have been saying they want for 15, 20 years. They've been saying for so long, we want partners for economic growth and development.
Welcome to Development and Research, where we talk about doing things differently to develop drugs and stop disease. I'm here with Mark Dybul, the architect of the greatest public health program of the 21st century. Welcome.
Nice to see you again, Ross. I was one of the architects.
One of the architects. It's not bragging if I say it. Your work has been on the AIDS pandemic, which for a while was the pandemic before we got another one, in the way the World War was the war before we got a second one. But if you were briefing yourself in 2002, what is the executive summary of that briefing? Mark, here's how the last 23 years have gone.
Yeah. It's a good question to always look back. I think there's an important difference between HIV and other diseases because you actually have to build an entire infrastructure to deliver daily therapy and daily prevention for someone's entire life. So it's not a vaccine campaign. It's not a short course of anti-tuberculosis or anti-malarial drugs. It's actually for life, which means you need a supply chain, you need a massive human resource system, you need logistics, you need everything. And then you need ongoing research and development to have better and better products. And that is the revolutionary part of it. And I think one of the greatest legacies of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is the program you mentioned, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, is the fight against those diseases, but it's actually the infrastructure that was built that is down to the community level. And the focus on the countries rather than individual programs that were run out of Washington or London or wherever, became national because you can't fight the pandemic that was HIV. For those who don't know, a third of adults were infected in many countries. 2/3 of pregnant women in some districts in Botswana were infected, which means they and all their kids were
fractional children being born.
2/3 of women of reproductive age. And HIV, unlike most diseases which killed kids and adults, was mostly attacking 18 to 25, 30-year-olds, which is the heart of the reproductive and productive part of society.
Yeah.
So it was absolutely devastating. But and fighting that was essential to basically keeping countries from collapsing. But it was also a building of systems that were absolutely necessary for follow-on. In fact, during COVID, they were ready to respond down in the community level. They just had no support to do it.
Yeah.
Had they actually received the support, the Delta wave could easily have been prevented, the massive deaths that occurred. It is entirely possible that we could have prevented the follow-on waves of new variants, which were entirely predictable coming from Africa because there's so many young, healthy people, so the virus was bouncing all over.
Yeah.
So I think the lesson looking back is focus on things that are systemic, focus on things that the countries can do, support them to build their systems, and then allow them to run them. And we haven't quite done that. We shifted away from that.
So I want to cut in here with a scientific medical question. Was it clear to you, to anyone at the outset, that this was a fight where we could turn the tide without a vaccine?
Yes, you could turn the tide because treatment is effectively a vaccine if you can reach enough people. And we knew that we would continue our development.
So on transmission too, I think a thing which
Yeah.
many people don't understand today is that people whose HIV is controlled are generally not infectious to their partners, to the people.
Correct, which is why treatment is effectively a vaccine, because if you treat enough people, you bring the viral load down and transmission can be disrupted. But now we also have pre-exposure prophylaxis and a long-acting product, three of them, that can be given every 3 months. And now we have the ability to actually move towards eliminating this pandemic. And we knew technology would continue to evolve, but you had to have the systems in place to do that. I would also say that bureaucracy is more complicated than I thought back then. I often half joke, and it's only half joking, that if I knew then what I know now about the US government bureaucracy and bureaucracies in country, I'm not sure I would have thought PEPFAR was possible. Everyone said it wasn't possible. But actually it showed that if you have big ideas, you trust people, you support them, you can achieve almost anything. But we didn't evolve as much as we needed to evolve.
We hear the government,
The world, we didn't evolve the way we should have. Development has not moved, not just health, but development has not moved the way it should have or could have over the last 20 years. We stopped innovating. We just got stuck in our usual patterns and we haven't innovated enough.
I mean, there's one model of drug development that I think of that has become very standard for developing high-priced cancer therapies for some special condition in the US. So these things are being studied in the developed world with the developed world in mind, and the developers might as well forget that there are places outside the US and Europe.
Well, let's bring it back to self-interest on that point. First of all, it's not just specialized cancer drugs that only get studied in wealthy countries. And let's be clear, it's 50 to 60-year-old white men who get studied. We have very little diversity in our pools of research. And what we've found, even in our own countries, is that those products, whether it's antihypertensives or diabetic products, don't work in women and don't work in people of color because they have a different genetic makeup. So we're actually paying for a lot of drugs that don't work in huge parts of the population, so they get sick, and which is terrible from a human perspective, but we're also wasting money on drugs because we studied them the wrong way. But it's also for low-income countries. So chloroquine, the old drug we used to use for malaria, wasn't studied in Africa. It was studied in Europe. Shocking. It doesn't work particularly well. So we have to change the whole model.
The makeup of the other local diseases because of
in all probability, it's probably a whole mix of factors that include environment and also genes, our genetic makeup. We do have genetic differences that lead to different responses to different products. We have environmental conditions that lead to responses to different products. So, people at Harvard have actually studied anti-diabetics and antihypertensives in African Americans in the United States. They come from a different, diverse genetic pool. Their environment is different. Their social environment is different. And the drugs we give them don't work for diabetes and hypertension because of that mix of factors. Now, if they were part of clinical trials, we would actually have different answers.
It works this way in these people, works this way in these
exactly.
people.
And that's where we can get to with precision medicine if we actually expand the pool. So if we actually supported countries to move from academic research, which there are many places in Africa that do, by the way, Asia is no different than Africa. We would see the same thing. If we supported them to expand from their academic research to be able to conduct clinical trials to meet standards, and we need to shift a lot of those standards, we could actually have a very diverse genetic pool that would be relevant for the world. We could also do the studies much faster with less cost, which could lead to lower priced products. And the faster you get to market, the better it is for the companies. They make more money, but it's also better for people because then we have access to products that might actually work for them rather than don't work for them. So it's not just philanthropic or, let's help Africa. It actually is good for us. It's good for our own production. It's good for our own access to therapies if we change the system and supported other people. This is not a zero-sum game. This is actually a win-win for everyone.
I want to drill in there and on what PEPFAR has done to the landscape of commercial development in HIV drugs, or what it's done for infectious disease more broadly. I mean, the US government buys $1 billion of antiretrovirals a year. And if the US was buying $1 billion of airplane flaps a year, that would be an enormous industry. We wouldn't think about it as charity, and it would change the face of that industry.
Yeah.
What's changed about drug development?
There are many things that have changed. One of which is US-based pharmaceutical companies have developed global networks for global distribution. Now, it's not always it's never at the same price, but they still make a profit. Andrew Whitty, who's one of my heroes, always said it's the area under the curve. I can sell 100 things for $1 or one thing for $100.
Yep.
And I still am making money.
Yeah.
So because of these networks, you were able to have global production and distribution, and also a reduction in price.
And that wasn't true in 2002.
That was not true in 2002. Some might argue, well, that took away from U.S. business. It didn't take away from U.S. business. It added to their bottom line.
Yeah.
And that allowed them to invest in other products that then allowed us to have growth in these new products that, long-acting drugs that could eliminate HIV in the United States and eliminate HIV in Europe, as well as everywhere else.
Would we have seen those things coming to market now if the US government hadn't been $1 billion buyer of?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
No. The big innovation in HIV to begin with was going from 15 pills a day to 1 pill twice a day to 1 pill once a day. And not only did you have 1 pill once a day, you had a far more effective, less toxic 1 pill once a day.
These are longer lasting molecules, or
they're longer lasting molecules. They're also less toxic molecules. So they're more focused on, you don't necessarily have to dose higher, but you have a greater efficacy without damaging other parts of our bodies,
Sure.
Which, every drug is a chemotherapy, right? Every drug has some impact on our cells otherwise, which is why moving to immunotherapy is so important, and HIV is driving that along with cancer as well. But we were able to get to 3 in 1. Now, it was actually several companies that had the drugs that needed to go into that pill.
Mm-hmm.
And the CEO of Gilead told me if it weren't for PEPFAR, we never would have had that product.
It would have been 3 pills at best.
It would have been 3 pills at best, because he said their boards would never have allowed for the US market to play with another pharmaceutical company to put those pills together. But as long as it was for a global market, he could convince them to do it, but then they could bring it back to the United States.
Bring it back here. And now American patients
revolutionized how Americans were treated, revolutionized how we would not be in the position we are in now related to HIV in the United States or Europe were it not for PEPFAR. You can say that actually this former CEO of Gilead told me that directly. So innovation was occurring because of the new different type of market that occurred, which then improved the health of people in the United States and led to massive profits for US pharmaceutical companies.
Just to take a concrete example, do you see the shadow of that in how the response to the COVID pandemic played out?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good question. I think warp speed was a great example of what can happen when we all work together and achieve something extraordinary based on a technology that many people thought was not useful. It was very difficult. Drew Weissman, who was a co-Nobel laureate, was my first lab supervisor at NIH. And he struggled for years to get people to pay attention to mRNA as a possible vaccine. And then it wound up working very well for COVID. But warp speed, Trump administration initiative, allowed for pharmaceutical companies to come together with research institutions like the National Institutes of Health and producers to put together a system that allowed warp speed production and clearance through regulatory authorities.
Yeah.
Why do we have to wait for a crisis for that?
Yeah.
Well, it's totally unnecessary. Our systems are antiquated. It's rather extraordinary to me that in the area that should be the most innovative and creative in the world, research and development, by definition, you're talking about innovation, is sclerotic. We are still doing things and have processes the way we did them 75 years ago. And we could be moving much faster, and warp speed demonstrated that to us. We could be moving much faster to produce products, to study them in a more effective and efficient way, to approve them in a more effective and efficient way, which is good for our own companies, but also good for access for people, not only in our own country, around the world. And that also improves our position in the world from a financial perspective, but also from a humanitarian perspective.
I mean, we're the people who are exporting the world's medicine.
Correct. If we do it right.
Sure.
And it doesn't matter if we produce all of it at home, the benefits come at home.
Say more about that.
Well, and that's what we saw with HIV. Companies in the United States realized that they could produce a lot in the United States, but for lower income markets where the profit or the revenue they could grow from them, get for each product, had to be lower. It was a supply, and the supply chain became a global supply.
Yeah.
And that global supply allowed for global access, which then is good for us.
But the learning curve on that stuff improves the products, as you say, and we bring those products home.
Yes. And faster, if we did it right. But the whole system needs to change. And then our whole development system needs to change in addition. I mean, we are operating so many systems in research and development, including global access, which is the end of research. You don't have to research and development just to have research and development. You have research and development to sell things, which means a global market, because you can make a lot more if you sell around the world than if you just sell in the United States or Europe. And China's gotten into this game. For a long time, China only produced products for itself. Now they're moving to a global marketplace. India has been doing this for quite a while. The US is just behind. And we need to accelerate our efforts in research and development. And we need to bring technology into our research and development, which is beginning, but really at a much slower pace than it should. Others are moving much faster. A great example, at least to me, is the FDA not approving MDMA for post-traumatic stress, including in our own military.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that's revisited.
So this is an interesting one, because I think I go in with the other opinion here. My understanding of the trial is that there wasn't much question about efficacy on the numbers, and that it was clear that the trial was effectively unblinded. Did the FDA make the wrong call on? I mean, this standard is blinded trials, and they went in with a trial that effectively was unblinded. Should we be having a broader conversation about how to do trials, or was this the test case that the world should have turned on?
I wouldn't say it's just the issue of blinded versus unblinded, but let's stick with that. The way we do trials is absurd. I mean, randomized controlled trials have a place. But they don't have a place for all things to be studied.
Yeah, they are not the only way that we're going to learn.
And we spend, the price of our products is directly related to that, because it takes years and years and years. In fact, the size of the trials, of clinical trials, phase 3, the trials that allow you to get to regulatory approval, have grown in size over the past 10 years. Most people would be shocked. There's one being done on a tuberculosis drug that's almost $500 million, hundreds of millions of dollars to do the last phase of the trial, let alone the beginning of them. We don't need to be doing these.
And where do those costs come from? We're studying tens of thousands of people.
Because you're adding so many people, and then it takes so long to do the trials, because we're still gets back to what we started at the beginning, we're still enrolling everyone in a few hospitals in the United States and Europe instead of around the world, which leads to no genetic diversity, which leads to products that we're paying for that are too expensive because it took too long to get to market, and they don't work in a lot of people because we didn't study them in a diverse enough pool.
At least it's scraping the barrel for trying to recruit patients. I mean, there are trials that struggle to recruit with diseases that millions of people around the world have.
Exactly correct.
How are you doing that? It's because you went to exactly the wrong place and did all of your study there.
Which is understandable, because you have to meet a certain standard for the trial to collect the data in a way that is meaningful and can be used. But that can be done much better with technology that exists today. It can be much faster, and we don't need to be doing the trials the way we're doing them in this massive randomized controlled way. There are some things you do need to do that for, but what is the problem with an open label trial that shows a 77% efficacy in converting people who are literally suicidal from being healthy in a couple of months? So the MDMA issue was partially the trial design, but it was also just the politics. We're letting psychedelics into the marketplace. People were upset about that. And then you get conservative regulatory agencies that get nervous about that. And there is an issue that needs to be studied, which is what is the rate of people who then become addicted to a psychedelic product. And then you could have pathways that could be problematic for society. Well, you can study that after this trial. And they did look at it within the trial, but that's very simple. All you have to do is after the study's done and approved, you follow people for 5 years to see what happens. And if you have to, you withdraw the approval, but don't.
But say study it for 5 years before you can start selling it makes many of these things dead in the water.
Dead in the water.
From a commercial perspective.
From a commercial. And then we don't ever get access to them because no one can afford it.
Develops.
One of the things every investor will say when a new biotech company or a new innovative product is coming out there is, how are you going to get access to a global marketplace? Because if you can't get access to a global market, so that's what biotechs have to sell to a large pharmaceutical company who has that. If we change the system, the innovation would lead to improvement in our health dramatically. This is very true in immunotherapy, which is the future. There's no reason if we changed what we do that within 10 years, we could not be done with chemotherapy for cancer, chemotherapy for most drugs, where our own immune system would be able to manage the vast majority of disease. And the more we learn, the more we understand the immune system is very important for diabetes, for hypertension, for neurological diseases. If we actually changed the way we did things from beginning to end, and where we did things from beginning to end, we could have a much healthier, lower cost health system than we have today.
But, and I think I can finish the end of the sentence here, we need to understand how that works across humanity.
Yes.
We're not going to understand what makes the stuff work or not work by looking at a narrow slice.
We can't.
In American hospitals.
The United States, everywhere in the world is very genetically diverse. But the people we study are not genetically diverse because of the way we do the studies.
And so we don't understand.
So we don't understand them. And then the system does not encourage innovation at the most rapid pace. And innovation is happening other places much faster. The pharmaceutical industry is very slow to adopt artificial intelligence right now. Others are not. 2/3 of young people in the world, which is where technology tends to emerge, are in low and middle income countries. If we support them, our companies can do very well by partnering with them and engaging with the young people around the world. You don't need 5 PhDs and 30 NIH grants anymore to design the next generation of a vaccine or the next generation of immunotherapy. You need access to the internet and good AI and technology, and we can, blow the doors off of all of this stuff. But we are living in a world in our research and development approach, and especially how we do clinical trials and how we do regulatory, that is the chokehold for getting new products to market and allowing that innovation to take hold. That all needs fundamental reform. Then we also need to reform our development systems in a way that we have evolved since 20 years ago when I began, and President Bush is very clear on this. If you asked anyone in development, what are you doing for education, nutrition, health, the answer would be, we're spending X amount of money. That was that. And President Bush said, I want to do something big on this topic, and I want it to be big. The first initiative Tony and I introduced was mother and child transmission reduction. We thought that was great.
Is education or
no therapy?
Okay.
There was a time a single pill that could be administered around the time of birth that reduced the transmission from mother to children by 50%, which saving a lot of kids' lives.
And so how much did you spend on?
Well, the proposal was $500 million over 5 years. The president adopted it, but then he turned and said, this is a nice start. I want to do something big. which led to antiretroviral therapy, which has saved 25 million lives around the world and lifted up GDPs of countries, which has been proven, lifted up our status in Africa. Many countries in Africa have a higher opinion of the United States than Americans have of the United States because of these types of programs. And diplomatically, we're in a geopolitical fight right now, battle. These things matter. So there was a lot of shift. Now everyone talks about results and what are you doing and how are you achieving things, which was largely driven by that vision that
throughout the government, throughout
the U.S. government and globally. It actually had a global impact on how organizations operated.
Medicine, healthcare organizations,
not just healthcare, all development. We shifted from how much money you're spending to what results are you achieving? How are you supporting countries? But it stalled. And we're now in some ways going back to the old model.
Has stalled, or the moving
forward. In many ways, we're moving back. We're going back to the old models, not about how much money are you spending, but more on we're going to run the programs, we're going to control the programs, and we do not involve the private sector, which was a part of the original vision, going back to research and development. We don't involve the private sector in how development occurs. And in the end, we focus on narrow things like an HIV, which is hugely important, HIV, malaria, TB, education, economic growth, agriculture. But they're all in these individual pieces, which first of all leads to chaos in the countries, but secondly, doesn't lead to development, doesn't lead to overall development. And ultimately, economic growth is going to be the engine of all development if it's equitable. We need development plans. We need the private sector at the table. We need to remake how we do development. Most organizations were created 70 years ago, 80 years ago. The bureaucracies have become bloated. Everything's overlapping, competitive. We need a total remake of the way we do things. And I think there's an opportunity for that. The founding of all this grew out of Bretton Woods, which was a meeting that was held in a town called Bretton Woods at the Mount Washington Hotel that led to the creation after World War II of the World Bank, fundamentally, then the International Monetary Fund, and the U.S. had the Marshall Plan as a bilateral program to rebuild Europe.
But the plan was we're just going to send money to them until we achieve success.
But the success was rebuilding their economies, which was philanthropic in a sense and a huge humanitarian thing to rebuild the economies of Europe. But it also was, as Adam Smith would say, enlightened self-interest, because we needed their economies for our economy to grow. And it was those investments that led to the markets that gave us the ability to become the greatest economy in the world. That same type of approach, that remaking for the 21st century of institutions, and that is going to be necessary with consolidations and closures, but with a 21st century approach of development, of economic growth, not just individual parts, but supporting countries. And that's what the countries want. They don't want all these
handouts. They don't want to get handouts.
The era, I've been saying for 15 years, we should never use the word aid again. We should never use the word assist or help. What we are partners with those countries to support their economic growth and development, like the Marshall Plan for their economic growth and development, which will then allow us to have access to markets just like the Marshall Plan did. And for our companies to thrive and to then learn things that we can bring back home to improve our own health, our own well-being, our own economies, our own technology. Our own technology could be growing in leaps and bounds if we would partner with these young kids in Africa who are dynamic and hungry and will come up with things that we can then use for our own advancement in technology. It is an opportunity to transform in a way that we have failed to do.
Shifting frames, I think, slightly, but staying on this question of partnerships. When multinational corporations want to set up partnerships with African governments to bring pieces of their development there for the enlightened self-interest, for the sort of broader opportunities, what are the models of that work, what don't work, what look like they work but are actually rotten through?
So we are further behind than China, in part because sometimes you need development agencies to be first loss investors, to de-risk, to draw the companies. But we're also behind in our own companies' understanding of Africa. A lot of people still see Africa as a country. And there are places in Africa that
one market, one
market,
homogeneous market.
and they are moving towards a continental union, like the African Union or the European Union. There are fits and starts, and it's going to take a long time. But it's a 1.3 billion people market. But most companies don't see the news of, this war or that war, or this disaster or that disaster. They don't see the opportunity that's there. Some do. Jamie Dimon just went to Africa to open 3 new offices. So there are places you can go that will lead to smart investments, economic growth, and development. But our companies haven't quite done that. And I think our government could do a better job at using our development infrastructure for that, rather than the way we've been using.
Soften the ground for our
Soften the ground, focus on the private sector. The private sector in development is always an afterthought rather than front and center. How do we have economic growth and development, which is the only way development's going to occur? You can't just do an HIV program. You can't just do a malaria program. You can't just do an education program. They all have to come together for economic growth and development plans. Rob Mosbacher, who ran OPIC, which was the private sector arm of the U.S. government, I suggested that 20 years ago. But we couldn't get anywhere because the bureaucracy wouldn't let us. So we don't start with the private sector. We don't start with how does investment occur. We don't start the way the Marshall Plan started. We don't start with how does economic growth and development occur and how do we support them. Whereas health and education are fundamental. You need a healthy, educated population.
Consume things, to develop things,
to work,
yep,
to create and to buy ultimately. Singapore, Korea, Norway, Japan. That's how they started to rebuild their economies, invested heavily in health and education. The US did that. We used to do that too a long time ago. We're falling behind because we don't. But we don't begin with the premise. The question is, how do we grow the economies and then fit everything into that? We start with, well, let's do this program or that program. So if we remade all of that, which we have the opportunity to do, I think, and that is the exciting moment today, both in global institutions, but also in how the US operates, we could succeed. China is way ahead of us on this because they don't have the bureaucratic challenges we have. They just go do it.
They're better at preparing a country that they're partnering with to be a trading partner. I mean, this is Belt and Road. They were doing investments, and this was raising their profile, but they were investing in things that would let their ships sail into the port. And
the reality is we can win this because the way they do it is they bring their own employees, which doesn't, lead to jobs locally. It's mostly loans, not actual investment. And so the countries get saddled with debt that they have to repay. So we could actually do it smarter and better. But right now we're just getting our butts kicked.
Because we're not even playing the game.
Because we're not playing the game. When I was in the administration, because PEPFAR was so important to President Bush, I was privileged to be in meetings with heads of state, and they didn't want to work with China. They wanted to work with us, but we couldn't offer them what they needed, which was someone to support their economic growth and development as a comprehensive approach.
Did you see that develop over the time that you were running PEPFAR? Did those meetings with those heads of state start in a very different place than they were 5 years later?
Yes, because China got much more engaged in those 5 years.
So it used to be the US or nothing. China came on to the board, but they still
were basically not first, because and the World Bank and other international finance institutions, even the African Zone Institution, the African Development Bank, the Export-Import Bank, are not quite where they need to be supporting these efforts. But it did evolve because China got more active. We are also not paying attention to the fact that Russia, United Arab Emirates, and others are getting in the game. We are really going to be out of the game. And we're seeing it in the political shifts and how countries have realigned themselves, formerly almost entirely with the United States, now a realignment where how positions that are taken related to Russia and China are very different than they used to be. So we are falling behind in every respect. We are losing the economic opportunity. We're losing the diplomatic opportunity. and the geopolitical opportunity. And we need to, if we redo everything and we do it correctly, we can actually basically use the PEPFAR model, which redid everything, and use that as the cutting edge as we did then to break open and start again and redo the Bretton Woods agreements for the modern era.
Exciting. And I do think that there's a, energy in the moment to be rethinking how we do things. I think the question is what is going to come out of when we break things down and build them back up.
The building back up is the important part.
Sure.
The breaking, you can do pretty quickly. The building is harder. But I think it's really important to emphasize that this isn't just it's what the leaders, it's what the countries have been saying they want for 15, 20 years. They've been saying for so long, we want partners for economic growth and development. We love these plans and they're part of it. We need a healthy population. We need an educated population. We need better agriculture. What Rwanda's doing with agriculture right now is mind-blowing with technology.
Yeah.
Which technology comes from the United States.
Yeah.
And President Kagame sees this. But we haven't put all the pieces together because our development system is fragmented and the private sector
Stuck in this mode of charity. We're doing charity. We're doing,
and for years, and again, for decades, I've been saying, stop. Africans, just like the Brazilians before and the Mexicans before, countries that have grown from dependency status and gotten themselves out of it, hate the U.S. government development because they were treated like children.
When it's handouts.
Because it's aid.
Yeah.
They don't want aid. They want a partner.
Yeah.
And they want to grow from a partner that supports their economic growth and development as holistically to a partner that becomes their technological and trading partner.
Mm-hmm.
And, moving from aid to trade is where we need to be going. And there are ways to do this just in the health sector.
Mm-hmm.
We don't focus on revenue generating health activity like clinical trials, which Nigeria alone estimates could create 500,000 jobs, good jobs, and $3.8 billion in revenue in 5-7 years.
Yeah.
That's revenue generation. That's not dependency. These are the things we need to be supporting.
So talk me through this. If you ran a pharma company, you're sitting on a treatment for influenza that takes mortality from its, 1% mortality if my grandmother gets symptomatic influenza to 0. So we're solving that problem. We're solving a problem that Americans, yes, have. But you're going at this with this global first mindset, looking at the whole game board. What are you going to do differently than you think the replacement CEO is going when you're trying to take this product from here to?
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of challenges, and I don't want to stick with just pharmaceutical companies. And let's stick with health for a second. I actually have a lot of empathy for CEO pharmaceutical. First of all, their shelf life is 2 years, and the incentive system is entirely built on what is my share price the next quarter.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not focused on in 10 years what happens and what will my company look like, because you're focused on your 2 years and your payouts, which is
meanwhile the research is going to happen 7 years from now, or 6 if I make all the right choices.
And
3 if I make.
And if you have to make these decisions today, and you do have to make them today, there is no established clinical trials capacity outside of South Africa in Africa. I mean, stick with Africa because I know it well, but Asia, Latin America, we have similar issues still, even though we have fairly advanced economies in a number of places. But outside of South Africa, there's very little clinical trial capacity. So you can't do a clinical trial in these places.
So what's going on there? Why is the best, first best hospital in Kigali, Kinshasa, Addis Ababa? Why are these not places where you can do a clinical trial to the level of what you'd see in Johannesburg? Or
it takes resources to get there. Okay. So we've done some of the work we've actually supported, and some of the work I've done to support a few countries to do an investment case, because that's what these are. These are investment cases on what do we need to invest to get to that $3.8 billion. And it turns out to be a couple $100 million.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty good return on investment, 10 to 1. But also jobs and the creation of, and we really from a geopolitical perspective, we really need to be focused on jobs for young people in low and middle income countries. Many countries in low and middle income countries, 75% of their population is under the age of 35. Most of them don't have jobs. Unemployment among young men in particular is 50, 60, 70%. That, and I know our national security people worry about this. That is a recipe for global instability that will damage the United States in ways that pandemics, are child's play. So we should be focused on that economic growth, similar to what we did for Europe. It would have been absolute chaos in Europe had the Marshall Plan and the World Bank not supported their economic growth. We should be doing the same for the same reasons, but in a different place now, because that's where young people are, and that's where the innovation can come from, and that's where the opportunity is. But it costs investments. It takes investment to reach clinical trials capacity, because you have to have data collected in a certain way. You have to have the right trained staff. And the vast majority of them are not medical. The vast majority are project managers, data analysts, monitors. These are completely portable within the economy. So they don't have to just be doing health. But we're not investing in it.
This is not like the hospital is lacking. It, needs beds it needs special equipment. We need people to do office work, research work.
There is some need for hardware. For example, there are very few places that have MRI and CT scan.
Okay.
Which we could actually,
which you need for some things and not for other things.
But if you're going to do an oncology, a cancer study or a neurologic study, you need that capacity. Sure. If you're going to study infectious diseases, you don't. But that's not a global market in the first place, for many of them. But they need those products anyway. So we should be supporting their research and development for that, and people like Drew Weissman are doing this. They're transferring their technology to investigators in low and middle income countries to develop their own vaccines for dengue and things that are in their countries, which then affect us globally too.
Yeah.
And that could be the next pandemic.
Yeah.
So this is all smart for us for a whole variety of reasons. But it does take some investment, and it's some hardware, diagnostics, data systems, but it's also software, people.
Yeah.
The investment is not huge relative to the output. Diagnostic centers, so MRI, CT scans, you can get an MRI or CT scan down to under $100 in these resource limited settings. If you run a business case on that, the return is massive, absolutely massive. You tie those to clinical trial sites, and now a lot of people can't afford that, and a lot of national health systems can't afford that. But there are plenty of wealthy people in those countries that can afford it. Instead of flying to India or China,
sure,
to get those done, they can get them done locally for $100.
Yeah,
they'll pay for that.
Yep.
And the national health systems, some of them send people to South Africa or India to get treated for cancer because they don't have the capacity. You now start saving all of that money. So the investment case is extraordinary, but it takes someone to invest, which gets back to, we do not link the investment pieces, the opportunity, the first loss pieces, the investment pieces in our development infrastructure that would create all of that.
Yeah.
And that's just for health.
Yeah.
Same for agriculture, same for education, same for business development. And then on the African side, the reality is the regulatory environment is not great. The governance environment needs work. Their work needs to be done there too. But there are places, again, Africa is not a country. There are places you can go get started on all this, show the model, and then everyone will drive and go forward with it. Just like with PEPFAR, we started with 14 countries. We didn't start with 100 countries, and showed the model that could then drive that.
Are there models in how corporate partnerships are working that we should start from and expand? Or is that coming at things from the wrong end?
There are some, but not many, and they're all limited. So there was a group of African and U.S. CEOs that would meet regularly to look for business opportunities, but it never really took off. There's something called in
biotech, we have biotech parks.
We have biotech parks that are being created now in Africa, but they're not biotech parks like our biotech parks. And there are groups like Wellcome Trust, Gates Foundation, and others that really could be investing there. There are huge foundations like the MasterCard Foundation, people don't know about, a $55 billion foundation that's going to grow to $100 billion, entirely focused on Africa.
Yeah.
there are ways to put all these
And
pieces.
less training and
Yeah, which is great, but you have to have a job to train someone.
sure,
So
you need the economic opportunity to hire someone for the job you're
yeah,
going to train.
so the investments have to be put together. So it's really just putting the pieces together by bringing everyone together. But we tend to go through these fits and starts of creativity and models, and then we forget them because the bureaucracy sucks it all back in.
Sure.
So I don't know of any great models for how this gets done. Maybe Jamie Dimon will be the one to figure it out. But if we actually focused on that, and by bringing the pieces together, by restructuring both our global institutions, but also our own institutions, and putting the private sector and economic growth at the center, which a lot of people in development don't want to do. They think, I just came from a meeting. I was like, how do we hold governments accountable for it's the responsibility of the government to provide health. It's the response. Yeah, but they don't have the money to do it. So why don't we but if you talk about the private sector and economic growth and development in the development world, you're anathema. This is humanitarian, only humanitarian. No, it's not. It's not humanitarian. Going back to the Marshall Plan, economic growth and development in the rest of the world is pretty good for us. And that's not globalization and the way and that's not shifting jobs from the United States. It's actually promoting our own economies.
What has COVID changed about that in healthcare, in health and pharma, in terms of national attitudes and how people are seeing, the importance of that?
It's rather unfortunate. It goes back to, there was a tremendous health infrastructure. And unlike in the United States, what the Africans built goes down to the community, literally down to villages. Now, it's not always the best there. It's not always and it's not digitized yet, but they have really remarkable systems and national data systems because of development.
And that gets down to people. My child has a fever. I've got a lump on my arm. That's the level where someone in an African village might have better access to healthcare than the US because they have that primary care.
They have access to identification. They might not have access to the care that goes with it.
Sure.
But you could build that.
Sure.
And that's also where you'd want to do a clinical trial.
Mhm.
If you're enrolling for COVID, you don't want to be in a tertiary care hospital.
Right.
You want to be in the community.
People have done that. People have done those trials.
Exactly. We were part of that. That's where you want to be. That's where you want to be for diabetes and hypertension.
Mhm.
You don't want to be at a university hospital, which is where we do all our clinical studies. You can't enroll quickly. It costs a fortune because your base costs are so much higher, and your enrollment takes forever because you have a limited pool. A lot of people drop out because they don't go to the tertiary care hospital, the university hospital all the time.
And the people you get are pretty weird because the people who end up in the hospital are not
the people who don't get identified in the community and taken care of.
Yeah.
So that the way they built the system actually allows for revolution in the sense that we can't do in the United States yet because we're not down to those types of
because
levels.
we don't deliver healthcare
don't-
except in the high cost.
We don't. Well, we do deliver healthcare. We all go to primary care doctors and everything else.
Sure.
But we don't have the research infrastructure that's down to that
Got
yet,
it.
which we could build there fairly quickly, which would be good for all of us. What's changed with COVID is the countries realize that they have to be self-sufficient,
Mhm.
that they can't, in the next pandemic, wait for someone to provide them with a vaccine
Because they didn't.
because they didn't, or a diagnostic. As an example, South Africa fielded 25,000 community healthcare workers to fan out to test people for COVID.
Mhm.
25,000. That's more than we had in the entire United States. Sierra Leone had 9,000 because they'd just gone through an Ebola pandemic.
Yep.
They were ready to do the same, but they didn't have any test kits. So
We had some trouble with test kits in the US too.
yeah, we did. But those could have been overcome easily because any university, every university in the United States and in Africa developed a genetic test. It's not that hard.
It was a regulatory issue.
Yeah, there's a regulatory issue. We wouldn't let them use them.
Yeah.
But that's led to some very healthy things, but also dangerous things in my view. So we're focused on manufacture, which I understand it's political and they do have to have manufacture locally, but that's not sustainable if you don't have a market.
Mhm.
And you have to have a constant market
Mhm.
and not just for COVID vaccines that are going to sit on a shelf. And that's where what Drew Weissman and others are doing to try to, dengue vaccines and other vaccines. But
Things for which there is going to be constant demand. We can build the foundations of the engine on the.
But then you have to build the rest of the ecosystem. so that you have the end-to-end research and development. And here I go back to clinical trials, not because I'm wed to clinical trials. I haven't done a clinical trial myself in 25, 30 years. I used to do them, but what is available is resources, because there are billions and billions of dollars in studies that can't be done because there aren't enough people in the current site that we're using. So a little investment in those clinical trials then yields to economic growth and development. And those resources can then be used to build the rest of the health system, which is where that $3.8 billion in Nigeria alone would come. And having been trained and being a professor of a university at a university in the United States, that's how a lot of universities grew. That's how a lot of university systems grew, by doing clinical trials, because there's money that comes in that you can't draw in otherwise. Same with these diagnostic centers. There are ways to invest in health that lead to economic growth and development, and that revenue generation, so we can get out of this aid dependency approach, which the countries don't want and is bad for us.
Do you see a distinction then in the sorts of programs that are building towards developing medical products for the African market and developing medical products in Africa and African partnerships for the high income country market?
Not yet. Again, I think there are some efforts occurring. Drew's working on it. He's been doing it actually for 20 years in Malaysia and Botswana, but it's not at scale. And because he's interested in RNA, it's focused on RNA, but dengue vaccines that are related to that. We should be doing this for everything, but it can't be manufacturer only. And that's the insight that Drew had. You have to start with the discovery, and then that discovery can help all of us. But then you need the clinical trial after you do the discovery, then you need the regulatory approach, and then you need global access. And all those pieces have to be done together. You can't just have one piece of an ecosystem. It will not be sustainable. And so you have to look at where can you invest now that will be revenue generating, so you're not just constantly dumping money in, that will feed the whole system.
Yep.
That's why I focus on clinical trials, diagnostic centers, things like that.
But clinical trials for products where the economic engine is going to be up in high income countries?
For now, yeah.
Sure.
Because they have a backlog of clinical trials that can't be done,
Sure.
that are costing them a fortune, that have huge overruns because they can't enroll people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you're all stuck in the same, take an oncology trial. You're all competing for the same 30 university hospitals for the same 20 people with that disease, especially as we get to rare diseases. Now, I think the FDA has done a good job on rare diseases, providing a lot of exceptions, but why are those exceptions only for rare diseases?
Yeah.
We should have that type of approach, that kind of energetic approach for everything. We did with HIV. We did with other things. Why don't we have...
Why are these exceptions and not revolutions in how we do things?
Especially as we move into immunotherapy and getting rid of...
What makes that different? What's going to make immunotherapy different?
Immunotherapy, let's just take something simple like cancer.
Sure.
It's simple. Cancer's not simple.
Well, normally we treat it with a chemotherapy, a small molecule poison. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what is that? It does kill the cancer, but it kills a lot of other things, which is why people get so sick.
You get this fine balance between...
How do you get cancer? Well, you get cancer because your own immune system fails.
Okay.
It's a failure of your own immune system. Why do we get sick from diseases? Or why do some people die from an infectious disease? Because your immune system failed. That's what a vaccine is designed to do, right? Boost your immune system so it can manage the disease. Yeah. There are many, many immunotherapies out there that literally within 10 years, we should be looking back and saying chemotherapy was barbaric, the same way we would look back at bloodletting now. It's what we have, and so it's not barbaric because it saves a lot of people's lives, but it's not a really smart way to attack cancer because you're attacking everything else. And that's because the cancer lives in our own cells, so you have to kill your own cells. Bacteria are really easy. They're these big things that float around outside of our cells.
They have different biology than us. We can target
and they're really easy.
And kill them.
They kill them, they die, and you don't kill much else.
Right.
But when something's in your cell, like cancer or HIV or other viruses, you have to kill the cells, which are our own cells.
Right.
And that leads to all these side effects. If we can stimulate the immune system either preventively, and I think we will see preventive cancer vaccines will be very effective, or just like we have pre-exposure prophylaxis, but also if you can boost the immune system to see the cancer or HIV or something else in a new way that allows your own immune system to attack the cells and eliminate the bad cells, but not the good cells, then you have a fundamentally different approach.
And that's going to happen more specifically with fewer effects than
when you immunotherapy. So right now, a lot of people are focused on CAR T, which is a great in between. But CAR T has a lot of side effects, and you have to really damage the immune system
in order replacing it.
Yeah, there are other approaches that are being developed, whether it's allogeneic dendritic vaccines or other dendritic vaccines or other types of natural killer cells, stimulation of the immune system that is failing to see your disease in a new way that can then attack and control the disease. There are nanoparticles. There are many approaches to immunotherapy that are out there, but our system is going to strangle them because it costs too much money to develop them.
It costs too much money, and these things, it's not that it costs too much money because the revenue potential for this is not there. You're talking about revolutionizing how we treat cancer. The revenue is there. The market's going to.
The revenue is there if it works. So there are two parts of it. One is a lot of great ideas don't in the end work.
Sure.
And you have to understand that and be willing to take those risks. And we need to be able to support that, but you can't support that if it costs $500 million or $1 billion, or the average is almost $1.5 billion to fully develop a drug to product.
Yeah.
You can't do that and make a bunch of mistakes.
Sure.
You can do it if it costs a lot less. And there are ways to get early signals with different approaches to regulatory and clinical trials that would allow us, and using AI, to understand whether or not something should be pursued or not, and whether or not you should invest, and then redesign the clinical trial so you don't have to spend $500 million on the phase 3 clinical trial.
Yeah.
So if we did all of that, then we can actually advance a lot of different therapies rather than the approach we're taking now.
What lets you pull those costs down? What lets you pull those costs down so dramatically?
Changing, first of all, where we do the studies.
Sure. If it costs a fraction, as you just said, deliver health.
We could actually do this current absurd approach to clinical trials for a lot less money if we did it elsewhere.
Just because
have the genetic diversity to actually tell us whether or not the product works. That's one thing. But more importantly, redesign how we do trials, how you do phase 1 trials to tell you whether or not you can move to phase 2. You could use AI to test different products in different ways to predict, should I take this drug to trial or not? Some companies are starting to do that. We have to be careful it's not quite there. So the FDA actually did approve a product based on an AI model that worked really well in one setting, but as soon as it got to another setting, the results were a lot worse. So we have to be careful about some of these early moves. But in terms of where and how we develop products and what is allowed to go to phase 1 trials and all the things that are necessary, and how you decide to move from phase 1 to phase 2, and how big that study needs to be, and whether or not you need to do a closed randomized controlled study with hundreds of thousands of people, or you can do it with a small number of people in an open study or a cohort observational study or a platform trial where you're comparing multiple drugs against each other, so you find out the best one, not one that works, that Medicare and Medicaid then pay for all of them. There are different approaches that we can be looking at and taking. Now, regulatory authorities, both the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and the FDA have signaled that they're open to this, but they're not moving fast.
So what's stopping us? They have applications on their desk that they're slow walking, or that they're throwing them.
We're not well staffed. We don't have a lot of people in the staff that are up to date on AI and those types of technological things. And there's just political fear that, you're going to make a mistake and there's going to be a problem, which is very understandable.
Are companies bringing them attempts at these new methods, or do we have this sort of vicious spiral where that fear is driving the industry?
They are, but in the end, until you get to the trial result, all the FDA can do is provide you informal guidance.
Yeah.
They can't say, we'll do this if you do that.
Sure.
And I think the FDA is a great organization that saved a lot of lives, but there are things we could do probably to advance them. And I think a lot of people on the staff would love to do that. They're just limited in what they're able to do because of the whole environment.
So here's a question that sounds maybe a little bit basic. Why do we care so much about what the FDA does? When, we talk about sclerotic regulatory systems, how is it that there's one regulator controls 4% of the people on this planet. Europe is larger. Africa's 4 times the population. Why is there the central importance of the FDA?
The basic reason is not a bad reason, which is quality. So most people don't want to most governments, most people don't want to receive poor quality products. And so you need to have strong regulatory authorities. That is not inexpensive to do. But the way we do it is outdated and takes too long. And then you look at something like the African Medicines Agency, which is very nascent. It was supposed to be up and running already, but lack of support and lots of other things. That is meant to be continental wide, or at least regional wide to start with.
As a drug regulator?
As a drug regulator.
So this is one approval process for 1.4 billion people. Yeah.
That's the vision. They might start regionally, which is what they're doing now, which would be fine too.
There's a model in Europe here where you have national regulators and harmizzation and cross recognition.
Which
is that where they're going?
European medicine. I hope they go a little bit further.
Okay.
Actually.
One office, one set of.
And all the countries would have to agree to that and support it. And that's going to be challenging. And maybe there's a system where you have a light touch in country that looks reviews, and you always have to have ethics boards because ethics systems are a little bit different. But we should be able to align and reconcile all of that, especially with modern technology.
Sure.
We're not stuck in we shouldn't be stuck in the old systems. And the African Medicines Agency actually has an opportunity to do something extraordinary if they get the support and the leaders, advance the way they hope to. Which gets back to the African Union trying to create itself a little bit like the European Union so that you have one marketplace of billions and billions of people, which for the United States would be a tremendous opportunity if we don't mess it up.
Rather than
country by country.
Country by country, one market at a time. This is too dense a thicket for companies to try to enter in.
And the Africans have signaled that they want to do different types of approaches, platform trials, use technology, use a different regulatory model because they're starting new, which makes it easier than if you're recreating. But we should be recreating it in our own.
We should also be doing that here. I mean,
we should be supporting them to do it. And then we could learn from them on how to do it better as well. So it's, the opportunity to make investments that will repay us 1,000-fold in every respect is there. Our current systems can't do it.
What's the way forward?
If you go back to the 20 years ago, when President Bush said,
we want to do something.
We want to do something beyond HIV, but we're not going to do it the way we did it before. Do it completely differently. And we did. And we did it by shifting from how much money you spend to what results are you getting to moving money and then providing an incentive system in country and within the US government to function. But we also did something which is essential if we're going to do this as a government ourselves and internationally. Unlike the rest of the government where we have 50 agencies doing everything and they have their own independent appropriation and they basically don't have to listen to anyone. All the money went to one person, the coordinator in the State Department, and that
person reported to the secretary.
Well, I was there. You functionally reported to the president, you lost them to secretary, and you then distributed the money to the agencies. So the agencies all had to work together because you controlled the money that they were getting. They didn't have an independent spigot.
Yeah.
And that requires reform within the US government. We actually studied the central command of the US military because prior to the 60s, in World War II or the Korean War, the independent parts of the US military, the Army, Navy, they wouldn't coordinate an attack, literally, which not too smart. So a central command was created. That's the kind of thing you need with accountability. You have to then, Congress needs to change too, because the appropriation, say you want economic growth in the private sector to drive development. Well, that's not the Foreign Affairs Committee. That's commerce. That's agriculture. That's different parts of the US government.
Need to all be taking action.
They all need to be working together, which means you need to do basically what we did with PEPFAR. You need to create someone who is accountable, who will get all of the money from all those different spigots and be accountable for economic growth and development, including the private sector. Right now, it's spread all over the government with independent everything, which goes back to what Rob Mosbacher and I wanted to do 20 years ago, where we said, why don't we take 5 countries where we have huge Millennium Challenge Corporation, huge USAID and PEPFAR programs, big OPIC, which is now the Development Finance Corporation program, and do a development plan, support the countries, and bring in the private sector.
We'll start from the end point where, we're trying to get this economic
That's the goal.
started in building.
So how do we all support that goal?
Yeah.
And have us impossible in the bureaucracy. But that's the kind of thing you can build. It is possible to do it. PEPFAR showed you can do it. Now it's hard to change all of the US government.
What made this possible? Was it just the president said, and how we're doing it? That's how things.
Yeah. The president had, when he announced PEPFAR, we counted there were around 70 presidential initiatives. He probably didn't know about 67. But this one he paid attention to.
Mhm.
And he made clear to the bureaucracy and in very smart ways that he was watching and this is what he expected. And yes, this is an assistant secretary of state level, but you secretaries are going to listen to what he says and your agencies are going to do what that person directs.
Yeah.
Because it's an accountable, results-based. We are going to see every 6 months what's happening. We're going to change how the money is used every 6 months. And we did. We shifted money from countries. We changed incentives. We work closely with the governments. Everything was national now, not little projects village by village.
Can you talk about that? Were there programs that seemed like good ideas at the time, then they hit reality and you had to trim them down?
Yeah, trim down or shift.
Sure.
So if targets were set, expectations were very clear and small number, not 1,000, small number. And when you pick those targets, you have to be very careful about how you pick them because you can set bad incentives. They have to be what I always call cascade. So to get to antiretroviral therapy, you have to do a whole bunch of other things, but don't monitor all those other things because then all people are going to be doing is spending time on
this and that and that.
Monitor, did you get to the antiretroviral therapy? Because then the rest of that stuff had to be built.
How many people are we treating? Not how many people did you walk into your clinic?
Exactly, which is what we often do. How many people do we reach? Who cares how many people you reach? How many people
are better?
Are better. And it can be the same with economic growth and development. This has always driven me nuts in the development world. They're like, that's too complicated. You can't measure it. You can measure it. You can't measure growth in GDP in 6 months, but you can, if you're trying to get to growth in GDP, what can you measure in 6-month intervals and what should be changing? And you can do that. Companies do that. So that's where the private sector, engaging the private sector into doing all this, and importantly, the countries, and importantly, the private sector in those countries. There are lots of very wealthy people that I know people who have invested in private hospitals, in private clinics, in private systems in Africa, just like we do in the United States. They make a lot of money. Work with them, and they will develop the systems that we then don't have to pay. But then that's good for our business because we have companies working with them too, investing in them, and we learn from them and bring things back to the United States. So the moment right now reminds me of 20 years ago when we looked at things in a different way. And people have been saying for 15 years, whether it's in the countries I work in, Africa, the heads of state, down to the village level, they want something different. They don't want aid. They don't want dependency. They want economic growth and development. We have models going back to the Marshall Plan and more recently models of how we can do this. But it has to be done intentionally with leadership, and it has to be done with global leaders and national leaders. And I think the US is in a position, as it was 20 years ago, to lead. And the people in the countries are ready there in their leadership to come together. But that means remaking how we do everything because our current systems will not allow for that. And it's not just within the executive branch. It's also how we legislate. It's how we think and what we focus on. And if we shift all of that, and we can not only support countries to grow, we can then, like the Marshall Plan, build the marketplace for our
enlightened side.
And I'll end with an anecdote. I worked with, I guess it's been long enough and the CEO's changed, the CEO of Walmart. When I was at PEPFAR, we did a lot of public-private partnerships, which was also anathema to the rest of the US government, like the one with Gilead that allowed triple therapy that saved so many lives and created so much money and revenue in the United States.
And better products.
And better products for our people. And we did a public-private partnership with Walmart. And the CEO invited me down and do this big Saturday event with the CEO and the entire staff.
Sure.
And we were talking before, and their offices are what people say. I mean, you're sitting in the CEO's office and it looks like, it's an IKEA, our college dorm. And they all did take out their own garbage, and it's all true. And I was asking him, why are you doing this? I don't understand why Walmart cares. He had been head of emerging markets for the company before he became CEO. He said, you can't see, but I have a lot of subsourcing in Africa, subsources. If I don't have a healthy population in Africa, I don't have those.
I'm not gonna get the
I don't get those goods right now. But what he said next was even more important. He said, I can't make my 10-year projections for growth if I don't have an economically growing Africa. And if we think that way
about the American economy,
and we build our systems and how we act based on that, we can transform not only the world, we can transform our own economy and be a little less worried about the fact that our population is decreasing, and we're not, because we will have the international growth that, like the Marshall Plan, fuels our own growth.
I think that's a great note to end on. And I think a really exciting vision that perhaps we have a moment to jump on here in the United States.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Thanks so much, Mark.
We've brought together an incredible group of people who are leaders in their fields. Each are coming at this from a different perspective, but the thing that unifies them is that they believe that something can be done differently, and they're doing it.
We think we can cut this Gordian knot.
To do it smarter and better.
Our equipment is even cheaper to grow.
Than brewing beer.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Giving biotechs the ability to think and act more like tech companies.
These conversations are laying out the pieces of the puzzle.
The market is willing to pay for some of these premium vaccines.
Turn down the dial on the immune system that's causing it to go haywire.
We should be looking back and saying chemotherapy was barbaric.
We have an opportunity to unlock a better, healthier world.
This is not a zero-sum game.
This is Development and Research, an interview series about fixing the broken world of clinical trials.